With ZZZ just releasing and BURNice around the corner, as well as the recent news about Lighter and Inagi, I think now is the perfect time to talk about team building in Zenless. There's 3 core ideas behind team building that make or break an amazing team. One of the first things people think of when building a team is elements and core passives. For example, a Juyen, BURNice, and Lucy team should function if you only are considering the core passive. However, when you consider the actual pieces themselves, they don't quite mesh. Juyen generally prefers a strong stun agent to help her take advantage of her high burst damage, as well as another either anomaly dealer for better uptime on chaotic metal's force-set corruption buff, whereas BURNice's requirement is another character to proc disorder, so her fire anomaly application gets full value. Juyen simply can't keep up, and Lucy's only fault here is that she's stealing Nicole's spot, so that BURNice can access her own passive. Could this comp work? Yes. If there was a high uptime attack disc set that wasn't tied to an element, maybe. But it would still be putting Juyen in a team archetype that isn't quite ideal for her personal damage, and would probably be a straight downgrade for BURNice's damage compared to Jane, Piper, or even Grace. Let's not forget that not every core passive is necessary. Lucy has been recently used in a lot of Jane teams with Seth, and her passive isn't active at all. So what is important then? I wanted to cover core passives first because it's often the only thing people are really considering when it comes to team building, whereas I think it's a little more complicated than that. Every team is made up of 2 types of characters. First are the DPS characters. They're your main damage dealers. These are your attack and anomaly characters like Ellen, Jane, Grace, Soldier 11, Juyen. All these characters do the most damage on your team. The second category are your supportive characters, and this isn't just the support class. These characters enable your DPS to do more damage, either directly or indirectly. The stun, support, and defense classes all fit this description perfectly. Don't get me wrong, these characters still do damage and are worth building long term to do additional damage. However, their damage isn't what's carrying your team. It's their buffs, debuffs, and stun multipliers that boost your team's overall damage, or their shields and daze buildup that provide comfort in challenging content. Each team has at least one character from each category, with the third and final character being flexible. We can see that in the current meta comps. For example, we have the attack stun support comps that are currently pretty popular, as well as the Jane hypercarry comp with Seth and either Rena or Lucy. We also have a few double DPS comps with anomaly characters. These are generally called disorder comps because their damage is directly tied to the anomaly mechanic in the game. Let's focus on that for a second and distinguish between the 2 types of damage dealers that we have. Everyone already understands the crit DPS characters, but in case you haven't, every crit DPS has a base damage scaling stat. So far it's been attack, but we know from Hoyo's other games that it could change to HP or defense. They also scale with crit rate and crit damage stats, since all of their damage is front-loaded into their initial hits. While they can trigger elemental anomalies, this isn't the main source of their damage. Anomaly damage calculations work similarly, where their damage formula is the same, but instead of crit stats, anomaly proficiency is the final multiple. You'll also find that most of their damage is backloaded into triggering an anomaly on an enemy. Only one anomaly can be applied on an enemy at a time, and at base duration, they'll last for 10 seconds. For ice and physical anomalies, their damage is instant, with an additional debuff that lasts for 10 seconds. For electric, ether, and fire, they have damage over time effects and action interruption for certain enemy types. Triggering a second anomaly of the same type refreshes the anomaly, wasting any of their remaining duration. This doesn't matter so much for ice and physical anomalies, as we can already see with Jane, but for a character like Grace, her fast anomaly buildup means that she can't function as a primary DPS the way that Jane can. However, if you trigger a different anomaly, you activate Disorder. Disorder pops any remaining damage over time and deals some additional bonus damage. It's important to note that triggering a disorder earlier doesn't actually impact the overall damage output, since the bonus damage is a static increase based on your character stats. This means that higher disorder numbers don't necessarily mean more damage, since that number doesn't count any damage over time that has already been dealt. For an off-field anomaly character like BURNice, she would most likely make an insane teammate for someone like Jane. Any additional assault procs that Jane has won't mean wasted damage, while BURNice adds disorder damage, further elevating Jane's existing teams. This team also works because different characters have different field type requirements. As we can see, BURNice's off-field ability means that Jane can be the center of attention for the majority of the fight, whereas with disorder comps with Grace, they've been a little more clunky and difficult to pull off due to Grace's lack of off-field application. Let's use an example from our previous archetype. Qingyi wouldn't be a good fit for Soldier 11, because Qingyi requires a lot of field time to apply her stun. She also has an insane stun damage multiplier, which Soldier 11 can't gain as much value from, since Soldier 11 prefers to be on field for a longer period of time. Zhiyan, however, has a lot more of a flexible field time, allowing her to pair fairly well with Qingyi. It's very important to know which characters in your roster have higher field time requirements, because you'll struggle to play two of these characters together. It's not impossible, like we've seen with Jane and Qingyi or Piper, but it takes a skilled player to make it really work. Conversely, if you build a team where none of your characters want field time, you may miss out on some valuable damage. Going back to elements and core passives, most attack characters generally want at least one character of the same element on their team. That way they can take better advantage of the elemental disc drive sets. It's even more important for a character like Nekomata, who has damage increases in her kit from physical anomalies. As we mentioned earlier, anomaly characters prefer teams with fewer characters of their element, because they build so much elemental anomaly on their own that they can take advantage of the disorder effect. This means that two anomaly characters of the same element would normally clash. Physical and ice may be able to function together in niche situations, but I wouldn't recommend it. This also means that supports like Nicole, who have a lot of anomaly build up, would pair well with anomaly characters whose element isn't either, as she could help proc additional disorder with her EX and chain attacks. All that being said, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't play an attack DPS with an anomaly DPS. For example, Nekomata's best team right now includes Piper and Lucy, with Piper providing additional physical anomaly procs and taking up some of the field time that Nekomata doesn't benefit from as much as other DPS characters. This team will probably work to incorporate Caesar now that she's been released, but the Piper team still works really well as a free-to-play option. It's important to have this core understanding before theory crafting about team comps, because it eliminates a lot of the questionable team comps immediately. For example, Piper and Jane activate each other's passives, so surely that means they can be played together, right? Well, for the average player, no, as they both fulfill the same role on a given team, similarly to how Ambi and Qingyi fill the same role on a team. Piper and Jane both would end up competing for field time, and only a very skilled player could get sufficient use out of either of them to make it worth running both. This is the main reason why I never recommend this comp, even though it can be pulled off. We can see from testing that it's not Jane's best team, and it's definitely not her most comfortable. Factoring these points in should also highlight how flexible a character like Caesar is. We already know from her passive that she could slot into any team, but her flexible field time requirements mean that she could fill the stun role for Zhiyan, Soldier 11, Nekomata, Ellen, or even Jane quite comfortably. Whether you want to use her as a parry bot, or primarily as a pseudo stun character, she can do it all, and even give a universal 1000 attack buff. So in summary, build teams in archetypes that make sense. Triple support or triple DPS are unlikely to be of high value. Secondly, build teams that make sense from a field time perspective. The last thing you want is a slot on the team that you simply never use because it would be a DPS loss, or a team that doesn't want to be on field and can't take advantage of that time. And finally, do still consider core passes that really matter, and consider which elements your team has or needs. Most of all though, have fun, because this video is about trying to enable you guys to make fun, viable teams with a variety of characters. I can't wait to try my Zhiyan, BURNice, Lucy team in Holo Zero. Ah shit, what have I started?